Tonight on PBS News Weekend, President Trump calls on Arab nations to take in more Palestinian refugees and talks of cleaning out Gaza as we get a look inside at the ongoing and desperate need for aid. Then some disabled workers are paid less than the minimum wage because of a nearly 90-year-old loophole in the law. And the sail-powered cargo ships that may be charting a course to sustainability on the high seas.
We want to not only reduce the carbon footprint, we want to kill it.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. In the Middle East tonight, efforts are underway to resolve a dispute between Israel and Hamas over a female hostage Hamas said they'd release yesterday, but didn't. That led Israel to prevent tens of thousands of Palestinians from returning to northern Gaza. Now, according to reports, Hamas and Islamic Jihad said the hostage could be released this week. This as President Trump suggested that Egypt and Jordan take in more Palestinians in order to clean out Gaza. That's an idea Jordan rejected and Egypt is very unlikely to accept. For now, the delicate ceasefire is allowing food and supplies to flow into Gaza. But after 15 months of war, the need is great and the situation remains dire for Gazans, not the least of which for children. Rosalia Boland of UNICEF spoke to Ali Rogan from inside Gaza, where her organization has been helping families since the war began.
Rosalia, thank you so much for joining us. What is life like in Gaza these days?
The bombings, the explosions, the violence has stopped. But the deep deprivation that family face here does continue. Children and their families are in need of about everything, really. The moment I step out of the compound, the UNICEF compound here in Al Mawasi, I see makeshift tents as far as the eye stretches, tents made of cloth, plastic sheeting, improvised. The deprivation is not just limited to the shelter situation. There's garbage littered all over Gaza. There's raw sewage floating through areas where people have set up their tents. Diseases are rampant. I see plenty of children with skin rash, children coughing. Parents tell me their kids have diarrhea. So there's lots of suffering there too. It's obviously a very dangerous environment because of the rubble, all sorts of sharp objects, because of the garbage and the open sewage. Kids are roaming around in that all day long. That's not an environment for any child to be in. They're really exposed to many different kinds of dangers in this environment.
Is it possible to identify the need that currently is the greatest?
Beyond the sort of cross-cutting living conditions, protection from the cold, warm shelter, access to nutritious meals, clean water, and healthcare, I'd say that children's suffering isn't just physical, it's also psychological. Every single child I come across has a story of loss or of deep trauma. Kids in Gaza have witnessed things that no child should ever have to witness, really. Children have spoken to me about death, about the ones that they've lost, about being afraid to die themselves. It was a 5-year-old boy whom I met who survived a bombing on his home. However, he sustained a skull fracture that made him blind. His eyes went to heaven before he did. That's how he put it to me. And so these children are in dire need of psychosocial support.
We hear what sounds like a constant drone in your background. Are those airplanes? What are some of the sounds that children and everybody are experiencing constantly.
The sound of the drones flying over is really a constant. It's almost as if it's white noise. It's there permanently. With the ceasefire now, it does briefly stop throughout the day, and then it comes back. So it's a sound that is omnipresent that children find very ominous and very, very scary. And yeah, it's one of the defining sounds of this war, really.
We have been in this stage where a ceasefire has been declared. How is the ceasefire translating into the refugees, the people that you're with on a daily basis?
It has largely halted the killings and the maiming of children here in Gaza. This underlines that this ceasefire is vital for saving children's lives. And it is important for that reason that it's a lasting ceasefire. It's been 15 very long months for children here in Gaza and for the hostages and the families of the hostages. Now, in terms of how it has been received, there's lots of mixed feelings among the adults. The children are filled with hope. There's one boy who was describing to me a playground right opposite his house, and how he is just longing to be able to go to that particular playground and play football, and go use the swings. I've traveled a lot throughout Gaza these past 4 months, and I was actually quite heartbroken hearing these children talk about all these things they can't wait to do, because the devastation in Gaza is very extensive. In some areas, for instance in Khan Yunis, in Rafah, when you see the landscape, it's as if there's been a major earthquake. There's not a single structure that is still standing, and kids are just so much looking forward to leaving all of that behind. But whether they'll be able to do that, that doesn't seem to be the case. Since the start of the ceasefire, all humanitarian aid agencies have enormously accelerated the inflow of aid supplies, including UNICEF. So that's a good start. That inflow has to be sustained. But, humanitarian aid will get these people only so far. It is direly needed, and whatever is coming in, I am convinced personally, will save lives because the needs are so high. Ultimately, what we need is also the private sector to be able to operate in Gaza so that families can access fresh produce in the market. We need the rubble to be removed. Families need to be able to return to their homes and leave the tents behind. All of that will take time. But there's a large number of operational constraints that we continue to face inside Gaza despite the ceasefire. The road conditions are very poor. There's lots of congestion. There's risk of unexploded ordnance. There's risk also of looting by criminal groups. So there's all sorts of constraints that need to be addressed for us to have unfettered access.
Rosalia Bolen with UNICEF, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
On Israel's northern front, tensions are high in Lebanon after more than 20 people were killed by Israeli forces. Lebanese health officials said 22 people died and more than 120 were injured when Israeli troops opened fire on protesters. Some of them were carrying Hezbollah flags. They're protesting the Israeli military's continued presence in Lebanon. The ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah set today as the deadline for their withdrawal. The Israeli military said they need to remain to make sure Hezbollah doesn't regroup in the area. Weekend rain is bringing some relief to fire-ravaged Southern California, but it's also raising concerns about possible flooding and mudslides. The storms have helped firefighters clamp down on the Palisades and Eaton fires, which are both nearly 100% contained. But the rain could create toxic ash runoff that could sweep up the remnants of cars, furniture, paint, and plastics. More rain is in the forecast for Monday. Vice President J.D. Vance is standing behind President Trump's blanket pardon of the January 6th rioters who stormed the Capitol. Vance had previously said that those who committed violence against police that day should not be pardoned. Vance spoke on CBS's Face the Nation in his first television interview since the inauguration.
Violence against a police officer is not justified, but that doesn't mean that you should have Merrick Garland's weaponized Department of Justice expose you to incredibly unfair process, to denial of constitutional rights, and frankly, to a double standard that was not applied to many people, including, of course, the Black Lives Matter rioters who killed over 24 people and never had the weight of a weaponized Department of Justice come against them. The pardon power is not just for people who are angels or people who are perfect.
Also in the interview, Vance said despite the fact that the heads of big tech contributed millions of dollars to the Trump inauguration, their companies are still on notice about having too much power, and he warned them to stop engaging in censorship. On the eve of World Holocaust Day, Pope Francis warned of the scourge of anti-Semitism. During his Sunday prayers, the pontiff said the horrors of the Holocaust should not be forgotten or denied. Tomorrow marks 80 years since the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, the fate of a federal law that allows some disabled workers to be paid less than the minimum wage, and how sail-powered cargo ships may offer a cleaner way to transport goods across the globe.
This is PBS News Weekend from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, home of the PBS News Hour, weeknights on PBS.
The national minimum wage was established in a landmark labor law that President Franklin Roosevelt signed nearly 90 years ago. Today, the minimum wage is just over $7 an hour. But a provision in the law allows employers to pay certain workers with disabilities less than that. Ali Rogan is back with a conversation with Maria Town, the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. It's part of our series, Disability Reframed.
Maria, thank you for joining us. Why is it legal for some companies to pay some workers less than the minimum wage, which right now is $7.25? What's the history of this rule?
Well, in 1938, during the New Deal, the United States passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which sounds very good, and in many ways it is. It outlawed child labor, it established the 40-hour work week, and within the Fair Labor Standards Act, there is a section that allows employers to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. And this was originally created as a kind of incentive program to get employers to kind of hire people that were deemed unhireable. You know, it was based on the idea that disabled people were inherently less productive, so you could pay us less, but we still needed to work. And that policy and the programs associated with it have stayed in place, again, since 1938.
What is the environment like now for people in the workforce who have disabilities?
Well, so in the span of almost 90 years, we've had a whole disability civil rights movement happen that's still happening today that's actually been fairly successful. We've had the Rehabilitation Act that establishes non-discrimination by the federal government. We've passed the Americans with Disabilities Act and amended it to make it even better, where workers with disabilities can get reasonable accommodations so that we can be as effective as possible and thrive in our workplaces. We also have things like technology. You know, imagine how much the types of jobs available in our economy have changed from 1938, where you've got a lot of like factory labor, to today you have programming or customer service, right? We have remote work opportunities. We also have completely different ideas of people with disabilities. In 1938, you would not have seen a person like me running my organization because I would have never had an opportunity to go to school and get a quality, free and appropriate public education. Like, the whole landscape of disability has changed since this time. And in the statute that authorizes this program, it actually has a clause that says it only needs to stay in place while it's necessary. And we would argue it is no longer necessary nor right to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage.
And we should level set here. What types of industries and employers have used this program? What type of work is this program meant to incentivize?
It's a great question. Things like sorting documents, paper shredding, cleaning of buildings. You see a lot of companies that primarily hire people with disabilities doing maintenance work on buildings, lawn mowing services, things like that.
Is there any concern that if this rule is changed, that people may simply stop employing people who, until this point, they've been able to pay less money? Is there a concern that people might stop putting people with disabilities in these jobs?
That is a concern, and a lot of the families have that concern and are very vocal with that concern. And it is understandable. For many people who have worked in these jobs, they've actually been in these jobs for decades. And for a lot of families, this was an alternative to institutionalizing their loved one. So it was a good thing in maybe the 70s or the 80s, before we had things like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Olmstead decision. But research consistently shows that that fear is not based in reality. A new study from Northwestern University examined phase-outs of subminimum wage that have happened across the country, and there are a number of states that have already phased out this program. And what that study found is that employment actually improves for people with disabilities once subminimum wage is phased out. Not only does it improve, it actually opens up high-wage jobs for disabled people.
This proposal is coming at the end of the Biden administration, the beginning of the Trump one. Some allies of Mr. Trump have said that they would prefer that this rule stay as it is. Where do you think this ends up?
Well, ultimately, after the public comment period concludes, it will be up to the Trump administration to determine whether or not they've finalized this rule and what is included in that finalization. So they could do nothing with it, or they could decide to finalize it. And if they do, they can make a number of changes within the rule. And it is really up to us, the disability community, to make sure that the Trump administration does the right thing and ends this discriminatory program.
Maria Town, President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Among the flurry of executive orders President Trump signed on Inauguration Day was one saying the federal government recognizes only two sexes, male and female, and that sex is determined at birth. Mr. Trump and Republican congressional candidates made rolling back federal protections for transgender people a big issue. By one count, they spent nearly $215 million on network TV ads on the issue, much of it focusing on gender-affirming care for minors. Despite all this attention, a new study by researchers at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health finds that gender-affirming medications are very rarely prescribed to minors. Lindsay Dawson is the director of LGBTQ health policy at KFF, which is an independent source of information on national health issues. Lindsay, this study in JAMA Pediatrics looked at gender-affirming medications and prescriptions for them to adolescents. What did it find?
The study found that prescriptions for gender-affirming care, hormone therapy, and puberty blockers are actually very rare in adolescents. And this isn't surprising. It echoes other findings we've seen and really counters some of the misinformation and disinformation we've seen about being trans, being widespread and prolific. That really just is not the case. And this study is more evidence that speaks to that.
In previous studies that looked at gender-affirming surgery, and what did they find?
Gender-affirming surgery is effectively not occurring among minors. If you really scour the evidence, you will find occasionally minors are accessing this type of care. This is rare, and it is in cases where minors are experiencing really prolonged gender dysphoria. And these conversations and decisions are made very carefully between minors, providers, and parents. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a careful and thoughtful, iterative type of care.
Why all this political attention to what sounds like a very small number?
It's a really small number of people, and even among that small group, smaller shares are accessing gender-affirming medical care. But these issues have been deeply politicized and polarized, particularly in recent years in states and then in the campaign among the now Trump administration in particular.
And why do you think that is? Why make transgender people sort of the focus of these political attacks?
So much of this rests on stigma and discrimination and misinformation and disinformation, and really using that to fuel partisan debate and polarization.
How safe are these practices? How safe are gender-affirming medications? How safe is gender-affirming surgery?
So, as with any medical intervention, there are risks and benefits to it. That is the truth when you take an Advil for a headache, of course, and as with anything else. There are risks to gender-affirming care, but those are carefully thought about. Many of them can be mediated, and they're really long, thoughtful decisions that are made in a sort of group decision between young people and parents and providers.
Mr. Trump's executive order on this matter this week, a lot of what he says, he's framing this as protecting women, as trying to help women. His executive order says efforts to eradicate the biological reality of sex fundamentally attack women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, and well-being. What do you make of that?
I mean, it really follows in the footsteps of many of the debates that we saw with reproductive care and is aimed at limiting access to services for a group of people based on sex and gender lines.
Does this give us any hint or any clues as to future actions and future policies of the Trump administration?
So the executive order that came out on his first day in office was quite broad, and in many ways it was nonspecific. There were hints in it that the administration might seek to make good on campaign promises to limit gender-affirming care, but this executive order does not do that. There need to be additional actions, potentially rulemaking, which is a long process, and we, of course, may see litigation as well. So this isn't a change that will necessarily happen overnight and not something that the executive order does.
What's the effect, or what do you think the effect is on transgender people of all this, the discussion about it, the focus on it, and especially transgender adolescents?
There are trans youth who are denied access to medically necessary care that could prevent significant mental health problems, potentially even suicidality. And then there's the more cultural problem for LGBTQ people more generally, when there is significant animus to the LGBTQ community.
Lindsay Dawson of KFF, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
80% of all global trade travels by sea, and the ships carrying it account for 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, some shipping companies are taking a new tack as they try to navigate the industry to sustainability on the high seas. It might look like an old-school tall ship, but this vessel is charting a new course.
We always use the sail and only the sails. I mean, we don't use the engine, even in really bad weather.
Jan Jordan is the captain of the high-tech cargo carrier Grain de Sail 2.
Last crossing, we did a maximum speed of 18 knots and average speed about 11 knots.
Its fastest crossing took just 15 days from New York to Saint-Malo on the west coast of France. The only power? The wind. It's a new take on the clippers of yore, fitted out with 2 giant carbon fiber masts, an aluminum hull, and solar panels and hydro generators to power the ship's electronics. Jacques Barrault founded the Grain de Sail with his twin brother Olivier. They used profits from their chocolate and coffee business in France to build their first sail-powered cargo ship.
The position of the Grand Sail fleet is to be at minus 90% compared to the usual carbon footprint.
That's less than 2 grams of carbon emissions per ton per kilometer. By comparison, the most efficient container ships on the sea today emit 10 to 40 grams of CO2. An airplane emits as much as 800 grams per ton.
We want to not only reduce the carbon footprint, we want to kill it.
He acknowledges that it comes with a hefty price tag.
The cost of the transportation, when you want to be compatible with the environment, it's more expensive, but that's the normal price is here. When you are transporting goods with fuel, you don't pay the pollution, you don't pay the global warming, it's free. So that's normal that it's it's very cheap.
The European Union is trying to change that. Starting this year, large container ships will pay for some of their emissions. About 165 cargo ships around the world already use some wind power to save fuel. The regulatory pressure could make wind more appealing. The grain to sail to is half the length of a soccer field and carries up to 350 tons of cargo. Not much compared to the hundreds of thousands carried by some diesel-powered ships.
We will need in 20 years to reduce the quantity of goods transported across the oceans. If we don't succeed to reduce this amount of goods transported, it's not going to work.
The Barrault twins want to launch a third boat in 2027 that will carry 8 times more cargo, helping drive down costs. Jan Jourdain guesses he would earn 4 times as much working on a big cargo ship, but he says he can't stomach going back. He's got something besides money putting wind in his sails.
I also do it for my son, for him to be proud of what I did, maybe. Hey, Daddy, what did you do to improve the situation? Well, I did my best to make my job in a clean way.
That is PBS News Weekend for this Sunday, and I'm John Yang. Thanks for joining us. Have a good week.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
In 1995, 2 friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% U.S.-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.